Today we are talking with Kirk Morris about some of the programs that he has tried to help implement in the Philippines to assist the local people in various projects that they're doing. Many of the expats here spend a lot of time trying to help the Filipino people and the Filipino authorities to improve their facilities. Kirk is definitely one of those. So, Kirk, would you like to tell us the stories of some of the things that you've tried to help with here?
Sure. For the most part, prior to my arrival in the Philippines, my altruistic sense came from my involvement in crisis mapping across the world during the crisis events in the Philippines, or if in Haiti, or Syria, or Libya, or the floods of Pakistan. I learned how to be involved, and the fact that any individual could partake and participate in recovery and response to disaster. So when I first arrived, I had that sense about me, and I felt that I needed to do something that was of a positive nature. My first girlfriend was a young lady who had gone to work on her parents' request when she was 16 years old, and she had not finished 6th grade. Immediately I said, okay, you have to finish, you have to get a certificate. And I investigated ALS. I investigated alternative learning system, which allows Filipinos, whether you're grandmothers, grandfathers, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, a way of completing high school or grade school or elementary school, wherever your level was. Fortunately, she was able to go on to finish a high school certificate through ALS. When I first investigated, nobody in the community I was living had any idea where it was, who you spoke to, what you did. And finally, after weeks of investigation, I found out, oh, it's at the elementary school, the superintendent's there, and the person who leads ALS in the community is there as well. So he and I devised a poster that we had printed in Cebu, which was ALS, what the benefits, who can participate, when registration is. We had it printed. I then drove to every single barangay in the city to deposit the poster at elementary schools, at Series stores, wherever it would gain, at rural health units, wherever it would gain attention. We increased ALS participation that year by 35%.
Was this poster done in English or in Visaya?
It was in English, but given the fact that so many people speak English or read English in the Philippines, so many children do because it's taught in school, they don't necessarily speak it, but they can read it and they can write it. They don't speak it because they often don't have the opportunity of speaking English with an English-speaking person. So after that, I got to know the Monsignor of the city I was living in, and he and I devised a plan that would involve fishermen collecting their nets, their used nets, the nets that were in the sea, the nets that were stored at home, the nets that were buried on beaches, collect them and package them and bundle them and sell them, I'm not moving, and bundling them by the kilo. They could sell them by the kilo. Those nets were then shipped to Cebu, where from Cebu they went to Europe and they were transferred into rugs, nets to rugs. That was the program. I worked with every fisherman from, not every, but most fishermen along the shoreline of Darwin, Bacong, Dumaguete, up to Sibulan.
This is all in Negros Island.
Yeah, all in Negros Oriental, and I spent about 4 or 5 weeks just driving up and down the coastline, stopping in communities, meeting the fishermen on the shoreline, and explaining the program to them. We had a meeting at the church in the local community with the Monsignor and the people who came in from Manila, who administered the plan, which was financed by the Zoological Society of London. It didn't cost anything. It didn't cost me anything but time. I didn't have to contribute any money whatsoever, but we benefited, and we also benefited by the Monsignor being able to set up a community bank in a community on the mountain, which allowed them to buy a truck and convey their produce that they were growing to the market. Whereas before, they didn't have a vehicle they could drive down the mountain over the rough, rocky roads.
This would have been very interesting, just some of the people that you met along the way doing that, I would imagine.
Well, I mean, I think the fascination is that you don't isolate yourself from the community you live in. You actually meet the people, you talk with them, you sit down and you share a meal with them, so that you're introduced to the culture of the Philippines rather than just hanging out with foreigners all day long and drinking your beer. Excuse me, that to me is boring, boring, boring.
There's plenty who do that.
Well, and I don't want to know them. Excuse me, I don't want to know you. And call me arrogant, call me a pissant, that's fine. I accept that. But I'd rather be involved in the community and doing something of benefit to the community. After that, I got involved with Silliman University and the School of Computer Studies, where we worked with an outfit called Medic Mobile, which is a group of people who formed, gave rural health workers the ability to deal with medical problems from a remote perspective. In Africa, for instance, there's at least 100 miles between a village and a local clinic or hospital. So what happens? The rural health workers can, by using this program, using text phones, using smartphones, using notebooks, using desktop computers, they can make patient records. Is it tuberculosis? Is it TB? I mean, is it AIDS? Is it cancer of the cervix? What is it? Is it a pregnancy? They can track all that on their text phones by entering it into a patient record. As soon as they get a signal, and in Africa you virtually have a signal almost anywhere, that information is transferred to a local server, which may be at the hospital, which may be at the regional health center. But here in the Philippines, you don't often have signals in the mountains. So when they enter and transcribe those records in their cell phones, because there's a SIM card that has the forms that goes behind the SIM in your phone. So you can design whatever forms you want, which will sit on a SIM card that's specially designed. They can create the patient record. As soon as they hit a signal, boom, it comes to the local server, whether it's at the hospital or the community or city health center. Benefit of that, if somebody's taking tuberculosis medication, if somebody's taking medication for AIDS, if a woman is diagnosed with cervical cancer, the health worker has a reminder on her phones, which not only will remind her, but will text the patient. Time for your treatment, time for your medication, time for you to visit your doctor for follow-up treatment for cervical cancer. The greatest number of deaths found in India from cervical cancer was not the lack of diagnosis. It was the fact that the patients did not follow up with their health care. That was the major cause of death. With Medic Mobile, that's no longer a problem because your rural health worker, your community health worker has access to the program that will remind the patient it's time for you to go to the doctor. And it will remind the health worker to give that patient a kick in the ass.
There's another problem here in the Philippines, though, that very often various medical problems are diagnosed and they know what they are, but the people don't actually have the money to pay for the treatment.
Well, it's not particular to the Philippines. I mean, yes, it's a problem in the Philippines, but it's a universal problem. You go to the United States and you think the wealthiest country in the world, and people can't seek health care. They hide their medical problems because they can't afford it. And they know they don't have the money and the financial ability to pay for their medical care, whether it's medication, surgery, chemotherapy. It's tough for people all over the world. People cannot afford health care. And in the Philippines, they have a public health system, but people can't afford. Now it's an open plan. Anybody can join PhilHealth. But PhilHealth, because of various reasons, is basically going broke. But at least people have access to some health care. And if you're pregnant in the Philippines, you don't have to pay for hospitalization. You can deliver your baby with minimal cost. Same with dengue fever. It's a minimal cost to the patient because of PhilHealth.
I believe that PhilHealth's suffering some severe problems because of the coronavirus and people being unemployed and not being able to keep their premiums up.
Well, more than that, but I won't get into it because I'm a foreigner and I shouldn't speak about things that foreigners should not speak about. But it's an enormous problem. But again, I will emphasize it's not particular to the Philippines. It's a universal problem across the world, healthcare. Next thing I did was I worked with the local, okay, I'll cut this short. Silliman University and myself worked with this program. We brought the people in from India, from Tibet, and from the United States. We had symposiums at Silliman University, we had symposiums at St. Paul, we had symposiums at Foundation University, where we had groups of students from nursing and from computer studies all in the same room. When have you ever heard of nursing students and computer studies students ever being in a room together, realizing that each can benefit the other? I don't know if it happens very often, but it was happening in the Philippines because of Silliman University, St. Paul, and Foundation University. We got the mayor of Baja City involved in the program, who was willing to test a certain protocol and work as a beta. So it was very successful. It took me 2 years to do this. What did it cost me? Nothing. Nothing. Just time. That's all. Communicating with the people, offshore, communicating with the people at Silliman University, communicating with the people at St. Paul and Foundation. That's all it took, was to expedite that, was time and energy. Next, this is personal. I first came to the Philippines 6 years ago, and I stayed at a Hotel Ascensia in Dumaguete. Very nice hotel. I budgeted 3 days to stay at the hotel. First morning out, I walk out, and there's a tricycle driver there and says, "Sir, may I help you?" And I said, "Sure, I need to go find a place to live, and you can introduce me to Dumaguete." The trike driver's name was Jimmy. Jimmy was one of the most honest persons I've ever met in the Philippines. First day I said, "Jimmy, here's 400 pesos. Thank you very much." He said, no sir, that's too much money." And we went down to like 250 pesos for the day. He subsequently drove me around for 3 days, and we found a place for me to live. He introduced me to the city and some aspects of the culture. He talked to me, he exchanged ideas with me. It was a wonderful experience in how to meet Dumaguete. Jimmy and I stayed in touch. He would take my girlfriends from the airport, from the port, would transfer friends to the airport, to the port. He was reliable. You text him, "Jimmy, I need this, I need that. Jimmy, could you bring a mattress? Can you bring a piece of foam up to my apartment?" I, for some reason, and to my failing, for 6 months I did not make contact with Jimmy. It was one of the biggest mistakes I made by not keeping contact with him for 6 months. I finally did. I reached out to him and said, "Jimmy, how are you?" And he responded, "Sir Kirk, I can't walk. I can't walk." I said, "What? You can't walk?" And he said, this was in August, latter part of August. And he said, "I went to the hospital, Holy Child, the first part of March. I wasn't diagnosed. The doctor looked at me, examined me, and said, 'You've got to take an MRI.'" I'm sorry, a Filipino spending 26,000 pesos on an MRI, they don't have it. They don't have it. They don't have 26,000 pesos. A tricycle driver may make 300 pesos a day. Jimmy wasn't able to drive. He wasn't able to support his family. I went and visited him that afternoon. This has nothing to do with my heroism. There's nothing. But I know how to use Facebook, and I have personal friends that I've developed over 6 years living in the Philippines who are Filipinos. Myself and a Filipino who works for SPI Global got together, and within an hour we had a post on Facebook. Within 2 hours we'd raised 26,000 pesos. I was able to call a local doctor at Ace Hospital, the head of neurology, and say, "Hey, I've got this guy. I think because he's been driving a tricycle for 16 years, he's lost function. Something has compressed the vertebra and it's pressing on the spine." She said to me, "Kirk, I think it could be tuberculosis." My response was, "What? What do you mean tuberculosis? What do you mean? Tuberculosis of the lungs." No, Kirk. No, Kirk. We went in, we had an MRI. Now, the local DRRMO office gave us the use of their ambulance for the day to transport Jimmy from his home to the hospital. No charge, nothing. 4 crew members spent the entire day at the hospital waiting for Jimmy to get his MRI, waiting to take him home without charge. Filipinos doing something for other Filipinos without charge. Impressive. Now, most foreigners don't know that Filipinos do that for each other. because they don't interact with the community. So we get the MRI. 2 days later, I go back for the results. Doctor says, because we don't want to bring Jimmy back and forth. Kirk, Jimmy has Pott's disease. What's Pott's disease? Oh, it's tuberculosis of the spine. It's like a growth. It's like a tumor with tuberculosis locating itself against the spine and the vertebra, causing the pressure, which doesn't allow him to use his bladder, doesn't allow him to defecate, and doesn't allow him to walk. So what's the solution? Well, doctor at Holy Child should have said, oh, well, let's take a skin test. Let's see if we got tuberculosis. No, get an MRI, 26,000 pesos. The guy doesn't have it, so he waits around for 6 months. Doctor at ACE immediately puts on a prescription for tuberculosis for a 10-month course. 10 months. 8 months later, Jimmy is walking. He's walking because the tumor on his spine, the infection, has reduced itself to nothing. We go up to a follow-up appointment to the doctor at ACE. He gets an x-ray. The x-ray result is read by the doctor. The doctor says, you have no damage. I haven't seen any recovery like this. I have not seen it. You've got no damage. You're only limited in the future to lifting. You can do anything. You can drive your tricycle. You can do anything you want.
You told me once that Jimmy was actually very instrumental in his own recovery.
Well, Jimmy was, because he never gave up. He always had faith. He's a very strong religious man. He had faith in his religion. He had faith in his ability to work himself through it. And he did that by exercise. He couldn't use his legs, but nonetheless, Jimmy exercised daily by doing lifts with his arm, keeping his upper body strong, exercising with water bottles on his legs. Jimmy worked. So when he recovered, he still had a muscle tone, believe it or not. He was able to get up on his feet. He was able to take a few steps. He worked religiously to recover. His effort is, it's hard to describe his effort. His effort was miraculous.
And where is Jimmy now?
Jimmy, 3 days ago, I was walking down the street in Dumaguete near Bo's Coffee, and I heard, hey, Kirk, hey, Kirk. And there was Jimmy waving to me, driving his tricycle. I mean, holy cow, what more could you want? The guy is back, he's making a living, he's supporting his family, and a year and so many months ago, he was unable to walk. So I didn't spend any, well, I spent minor amount of money, minor amount for an x-ray, minor amount for transportation, minor amount for this, to get food for the family, but I didn't put out any money. I just invested time in somebody who was a friend and somebody who I cared about. And that's the end of that story. I couldn't be happier for Jimmy and his family and his young daughter and his son. I mean, wonderful, wonderful people.
Tell us a little bit more about your crisis management and your involvement with Yolanda and Haiti and some of the other places.
Most of that crisis management was done through mapping and remote mapping because we had access to satellites. And you can get over 100, 200, 300 people who can work remotely together. You organize them through Skype. We had a group that was called Standby Task Force, which responded to the crisis in Libya, responded to the crisis in Syria, responded to the floods in Pakistan, to Haiti, and to Yolanda.
So when you say responded, they weren't actually there. They were doing it remotely.
You can work remotely. By you get all the information coming from the ground. You're working in coordination with the UN and the UN OCHA, and they're sending you the information points, what they need, what they want to be looked for. Now, UN OCHA and the U.S. military have very limited people to do their satellite reading their maps. Now, if you get a group of 200 people who have experience in reading maps and reading satellite images, that's a huge contribution to any effort. So you can get a response to the United Nations on the ground, or the military, whoever the military may be. And so they can respond to the crisis because they have exact imaging and a report on a map that's created that tells you where the bridge is out, where the cell tower is down, where the bodies have accumulated, where food can be distributed, where electrical is out, where the towers are down, so that immediately they have that image that's not only visual, but it's been put on a map as ascribed to by the requirements of UN OCHA. So that's what we did. We developed this for Haiti. in 2010, and over the next 4 years, we developed it further and further, and now it's an integral part of crisis mapping and disaster response.
And you tried to get some disaster relief organization organized here in the Philippines.
Well, I tried with DRRMO. I tried to do the same thing so they could map from Sibulan down to Dawan up to Valencia. They would have all their evacuation centers, their remote outposts, their health centers, everything. Whereas if it was mapped, any disaster with a ship offshore wouldn't have to call and say, where do I find Talay Health Center to drop food? They wouldn't have to be told, oh, you go up here, you go past this, and you go here, and you go there, and you look at the next tree, and you make a left. It would be on a map that they had access to sitting offshore. They could send a helicopter, boom, they had exact GPS location. But the problem was, which is often the case in the Philippines, you couldn't get all the people together to work together. Each community wanted to do their own thing. Okay, that's fine. I accept that. But in a disaster in this area, the community from Baya City all the way down to Chaton will be affected. And everybody has to learn to work together. Otherwise, it's going to be a hard, rough road.
If we move away from the Philippines for just a second, you were telling me a story a while ago about Haiti and the response that occurred there. Would you like to expand on that?
Well, that was the first implementation of crisis mapping. Port-au-Prince virtually did not have a map. There's a group called OpenStreetMaps, volunteer organization, that got together with hundreds of volunteers, and they literally mapped Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Where the buildings were, where the roads were, every aspect of Port-au-Prince within 48 hours was mapped so specifically that you knew where the building was, you knew what corner, you knew what the elevation, you knew what the GPS location was. That map became the go-to map for everybody in the world, including the U.S. military. That was built by a volunteer organization called OpenStreetMap that was done by remote mappers all over the world. An extraordinary effort. If you see the map grow and you see the map build on an animation, you'd be stunned at how that developed.
And what do you know about the response in Haiti and how the mapping actually aided that?
Well, when the map was published, it was published by a group out of Tufts University in Boston. The lead was a doctoral student at Tufts at the Fletcher School of International Studies, Patrick Meyer. And he gathered all the students at Tufts University remotely. They had the Haitian diaspora. They contacted them for translation. So you had Haitians online in a chat room translating tweets or translating Facebook posts, working with this group of matters, because everybody set up Skype chats, and you had different rooms for different responsibilities. And what they did, they were able to pinpoint cries for help, pinpoint cries for food, pinpoint cries for medical, all on a map, which then all of a sudden the U.S. State Department and the U.S. military noticed and went, holy shit. They could get a cry for help on a cell phone. That cry for help could be translated and from a tweet. That cry for help could then be verified, then be placed on a map, and the military would know where a rescue was needed within 10 minutes of that tweet going out.
Did this work the same way when Yolanda hit the Philippines?
Same way. I mean, it was developed by the same group of people, the same team, OpenStreetMap and Standby Task Force were the units that Standby Task Force worked with UN OCHA. They developed the platform by doing a beta test out of Colombia with the Bogota with the fire department in Colombia. It was the first collaboration between the UN and Standby Task Force where they worked together, learned how to develop the map. Then it worked another, like Pakistan and the floods in 2010. But then Libya happened. Libya blew up, and the UN had nobody on the ground for Libya. Nobody had anybody on the ground for Libya, including the military. There was nobody there to tell the people what were happening. Standby Task Force was called by the UN to say, hey, can you help us? Can you help gather information for us? So out of YouTube, out of Facebook, out of Twitter, the Standby Task Force volunteers were able to accumulate that information. They were able to find it and post it on a map. Now, it's not just random. Every single posting on the map is verified. There were people in Libya who set up broadcast stations on YouTube. So you were able to verify who these people were who were giving you precise information. The first weekend in Libya, a request went out by, I don't know if it was the World Food Program or the UN, I don't know who it was. But why did it go from 20,000 people a day going to the border to only less than 5,000 a day? By our mapping and by our having a constant eye on the movement of people, we were able to say, well, there are conflicts here, and there are conflicts here, and there are conflicts here, and they cannot get around them. Therefore, the flow of refugees has come to a halt. And that's from people looking at a distance. That's from reading satellites, talking with people who are on the ground through tweets, through Facebook, through YouTube, and not doing it irresponsibly, but actually verifying every single thing that goes up.
And that's a similar problem that was involved in Syria than the Philippines here, because it happened over such a vast area of the country. Most people in the Philippines heard of the disaster that took place in Tacloban, but in actual fact, the entire top of the Philippines was affected, all the way through Bantayan Island and
well, Rojas. Everybody up there through the top was affected. It was impacted. It was a horrible experience. It was massive, and the Philippines wasn't prepared for it, nor was anybody else, frankly. But because there are large NGOs, because there are NGOs who have dealt with this before, they're able to come in and mobilize their experience. Now, it may be a U.S. warship offshore which is providing the heavy equipment. It may be the U.S. warship who is providing the foodstuffs. It may be the U.S. warship that is providing the shelter, or it could be an organization called Shelter Box. The only thing Shelter Box is provide shelter. No bureaucracy, no politics. Their tents come in and they're delivered directly to the people. One of the best organizations in the world for crisis response is Shelter Box, and the other one is Doctors Without Borders. Two of the most responsible organizations in the world working to help and support people in crisis.
So effectively, if we could sum up your story here, Kirk, what you're really saying is that if you're going to be an expat moving to any country, that the more you involve yourself with the local community and the more that you can use your own expertise to help them, the more people you're going to get to know, the more influence you're going to have, the more they'll be able to help you. And effectively, what's the point of moving to another country and retiring there if all you're going to do is associate with the same people? Would that be right?
Well, I agree, but I will caution this. When you involve yourself in another culture, you're an outsider. You have to respect the local culture. You can't push your way in being the expert, knowing this, knowing that. You have to, like with Silliman University, Medic Mobile, I handed it over to Silliman University. I wasn't the front man. I let Silliman be the front man. So you've got to be able to take the back seat. You can't be the star of the show. You've got to do it very subtly, very quietly, and appreciate the culture and how far you can push it and how far you have to restrain yourself. But you're right, the most positive aspect of it is actually meeting the people.
And from what you tell us here, you've met everyone from tuk-tuk drivers right up to fishermen down the local community, to academics and government officials, the full range of people.
The full range, the healthcare providers in Dumaguete, the politicians in Dumaguete, DRRMO, academics. It's the whole. You're right, and most rewarding is sometimes the most rewarding are the fishermen, which I helped pull fishing nets in when I was here for the first 6 months. I had a ball with them. Every morning I would be down on the beach pulling in, and occasionally I'd bring some coffee. Occasionally I'd bring some bread, but that was it. I was pulling in nets with the fishermen, and sweating.
Well, I'm sure that they would thank you very much, and we thank you very much for sharing your experiences here with us today. Thank you very much, Kirk. We're sitting on your balcony. You've got a beautiful spot here, lovely outlook. So enjoy your time in the Philippines.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.